Those are mourners diving for cover at a funeral. Yes, this was a shooting at a funeral. It happened in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Authorities say that two gunmen opened fire at this event from the outside of the Destiny of Faith Church, which is on Pittsburgh's north side. This apparently happened just after noon.
Imagine how a funeral turns suddenly from people crying and mourning to people diving behind cars, kids on the ground, while the one they came to bury lies inside.
There were a total of 6 people who were shot outside the church. It was a pandemonium, a scene of pandemonium right after that happened.
6 more people were shot while walking out of another church. There's a pattern here that I want you to see. But before we get into the video that led up to this chaotic funeral, let me start you off with this one. To understand how a funeral turns into a war zone, you have to understand the world these young men were living in. We are talking about Chicago's South Side in the middle of the 2010s, the birthplace of drill music, a place where the songs and the streets got so tangled together that you could not always tell where the music stopped and the real bodies started. In this world, a diss track was never just a song. It was a receipt and a threat rolled into one. And more than a few times, it was the exact reason somebody ended up in a casket. Young men were building careers off of naming their enemies on camera, and those same enemies were watching, counting, and waiting. The whole scene ran on a simple and terrible engine. You hit us, we hit you back, and then you hit us back for hitting you back forever. Right in the middle of all of that stood a young rapper named Van Treese Chris, but the streets knew him as Dusky the Man. He was born on February 25, 1993, a Chicago boy through and through. He started putting out music around 2012. Over the next few years, he built himself a real name in the city, with one remix pulling in over 1 million views on YouTube and a project that had people paying attention to everything he dropped. He was tied to a set called MOB, which placed him firmly on one side of the long, bloody chessboard that is Chicago gang politics. He was respected and connected. He even caught a shout-out from a bigger, more established artist back in 2014. In the drill world, that kind of cosign is worth more than money, because it tells everybody you are somebody, but it also tells everybody exactly who to come looking for. Now here is where this story comes together, because Dusky did not run alone. One of the people he made music with was a young rapper named Marvell Williams, known to the world as FBG Wooski. The two of them dropped a track together called Shooters in 2018, and that friendship is a huge part of why what came next hit the whole scene so hard. Wooski was part of the Flyboy Gang, the same collective that produced other well-known Chicago names. He came up hard and loud. His big breakthrough was a diss track called Computers Remix that he put out near the end of 2017, and that record got views and started fires. It was raw, disrespectful on purpose, and earned him a title that would follow him for the rest of his life, the King Op, meaning the king of the opposition, the one man his enemies could not get to shut up, no matter how hard they tried. Wooski had an older brother, a man the streets called Big Mike, who ran on a completely different side from him. Different set, different loyalties, but the same blood, the same mother, the same house they grew up in. Big Mike has spoken openly about how strange and dangerous that position was, being torn between the little brother he loved and the homies he ran with.
I mean, I didn't really find out that Wooski was in it until a phone call.
Big Mike found out from behind a wall, on a jailhouse phone, that his baby brother was already knee-deep in a war with his own people, and he had to make a choice that no man should ever have to make.
If I was to allow them to kill my brother, what would that make me, bro? Like, who would I be if I let my homies kill my brother? And I gotta look at my mama every day.
Big Mike had real status in the hood, and for a long time, that status was a shield stretched over his little brother. He could make one phone call, tell people to let Wooski slide, and they would grant it, because going against Big Mike simply wasn't worth the smoke. But a shield like that only works while the man holding it is still standing on the block. The day Big Mike caught a case and got sent away, that protection went away right along with him. And the young shooters coming behind him, the ones who would kill you on camera and post it, didn't care about old rules or old respect. By January of 2018, Wooski had turned his beef all the way up. He put out that computer's remix video, and the disrespect packed inside it lit a match under every enemy he had ever made. It broke on October 9th, 2018. Just before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Dusky the Man was standing on the sidewalk in the 5600 block of South Michigan Avenue, over in the Washington Park neighborhood. It was an ordinary moment on an ordinary street, the kind of thing that happens 1,000 times a day. And then, according to what that young woman later told investigators, a brown car rolled through and the shots came pouring out of it. A drive-by, quick and cold and gone. Dusky was hit in the head. The woman beside him was shot in the left foot. Both of them were rushed to the University of Chicago Medical Center, but for Dusky, there was nothing anybody could do. He was pronounced dead at 33 minutes past 4 o'clock that same afternoon. 25 years old, and just like that, gone. And you have to keep the backdrop in mind here. Chicago in 2018 was living through some of its worst stretches of gun violence in years, especially on the South Side, and the police already understood that the funerals of young men tied to these conflicts were among the most dangerous gatherings in the entire city. So they watched those funerals and braced for them. Everybody in the scene understood, at least somewhere in the back of their mind, that burying somebody could get you buried alongside them. The detectives out of Area Central took the case, but there were no suspects and no arrests. Just a brown car that nobody could name and a young rapper on a cold table. And in a scene built on get-backs, a killing like that doesn't close a chapter, it opens one.
And one thing worth understanding about Chicago during this era is that killings like this rarely existed in isolation. A shooting was almost never viewed as a finished event. In many neighborhoods, it was viewed as the beginning of whatever came next. Detectives investigating gang-related murders often talked about retaliation cycles. One person gets killed, friends and family feel pressure to respond. The response creates another victim. Then another group feels pressure to answer that attack. Before long, people can barely remember what started the conflict in the first place. The names change, the locations change, but the pattern stays the same. Every new victim creates a fresh circle of grieving people, and inside that grief is often the temptation to seek revenge instead of justice. By the time Dusky was killed, Chicago had already seen years of these cycles play out across multiple neighborhoods. People in the community understood the danger. The question was whether anyone could stop what was already in motion.
13 days after Dusky the Man was killed, his people came together to bury him. The date was October 22, 2018. The place was the Bethlehem Star Missionary Baptist Church, located at 9231 South Cottage Grove Avenue in the Burnside neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. It was supposed to be a day of grief. Family, friends, and fellow artists filled the pews to send off a young man gone way too soon. Around 12:30 in the afternoon, as the service let out and people started filing outside toward their cars, the whole day came apart at the seams.
And police say they heard a barrage of shots just after noon. They were coming from across the street at a funeral for a local musician known as Dusky the Man was letting out.
Witnesses said it started with a couple of shots fired straight into the crowd, and then it exploded into something nobody was ready for. Some accounts described more than 50 rounds going off. People were diving under cars while some were sprinting back toward the church doors. Up to 5 of the mourners were reportedly armed, and they started firing back. So now you had gunfire pouring from both sides of the street, with a church full of grieving people trapped right in the middle of it. 4 men in hoodies were seen taking off running, and witnesses described a green Toyota Camry and a blue minivan pulling away from the madness. The pastor of that church, Roosevelt Watkins III, described pure chaos, with people running back inside while the doors were being secured behind them. Shots so close and rapid they sounded like a machine gun going off on the front steps. And right across the street sat a daycare full of little children, ages 2 to 6. The woman who ran it later said the shooting in that neighborhood was so constant that the kids already knew what to do when they heard gunfire. They knew to hit the floor.
And we just try to comfort them. I mean, I don't know what else to tell them. We don't know what else to tell them. We just hug them and just tell them it's going to be all right.
When the smoke finally cleared, 6 people had been shot. The one hurt the worst was the young rapper himself, FBG Wooski, who was hit in the head, the same wound that had killed his friend Dusky 13 days earlier. He was rushed to the University of Chicago Medical Center in critical condition, and for a while it looked like the King Op might not make it. The other 5 victims, who ranged in age from 18 to 27, were shot in the arms, the legs, and the body. And here's the part that almost does not make sense, because every single one of them survived, Wooski included. 6 people shot on the steps of a church, and not one of them dying there, in a city that had seen so much death. That alone felt like a small miracle.
When the police arrived, it was a very chaotic scene, crime scene extending 2 blocks with shell casings, multiple people shot.
Investigators marked shell casings up and down a 2-block stretch of Cottage Grove. They pulled every piece of area surveillance video they could find, but the streets stayed quiet, the way they always do.
Investigators have placed markers indicating where shell casings are located, but so far they have no one in custody. Police say they have not yet determined a motive for this shooting or even whether anyone in specific was targeted.
But it did not take long for the picture to come into focus. The department's spokesman said there was a high probability that the funeral attack and Dusky's murder were connected, that this was retaliation, plain and simple, one killing answered by another. The police had actually been keeping an eye on gang-related funerals, precisely because they understood these gatherings had turned into hunting grounds, places where everybody your enemy was looking for showed up at the same address on the same afternoon. But knowing a thing and stopping a thing are 2 very different things, and they could not stop this one. What makes funeral attacks so shocking is that they violate one of the few boundaries that almost every culture shares. Across countries, religions, and generations, funerals are supposed to be protected spaces. They are places where conflict pauses long enough for people to bury their dead. When violence reaches a funeral, it sends a message that nowhere is off limits. Not the church, not the cemetery, not even the final goodbye. Police departments around the country have dealt with this problem for years. In some cities, officers routinely increase patrols around funerals connected to gang conflicts because they understand that these gatherings bring together large groups of people linked to the same networks and rivalries. The problem is that protection only works if violence follows rules, and the people carrying out these attacks often do not care about rules at all. And it didn't even end at the church. 2 days later, on October 24th, in the same general part of the city, 5 men were shot on the 6200 block of South King Drive, with the gunman speeding off in a white sedan. Police again said there was a high probability this was simply the next swing in the same back and forth. Look at the math of it. 1 body led to a funeral. The funeral led to 6 more victims. Those 6 led to 5 more. That is 11 people shot and 1 man dead, all flowing out of a single killing, all inside of about 2 weeks. That is what a cycle looks like when nobody steps in to break it. As for Wooski, the man they call the King Op did the one thing his enemies never planned for. He lived, and confirmed on his own social media that he was alive and that he would pull through, and he did exactly that. He came back, went through rehab to get his body working right again, and returned to the studio. He even named one of his later projects Back from the Dead, which is about as honest a title as a man can give. And here's the thing that says the most about the world he lived in. After all of that, after clawing his way back from a headshot, Wooski did not step off the path. He kept dropping music aimed straight at his enemies, living loud and wearing that King Op crown like nothing had happened. Some people looked at that and admired the raw nerve of it. Others looked at it and saw a man who survived a miracle and still wouldn't leave the very life that nearly ended him. Either way, he lived, which is more than his friend Dusky ever got to do.
Survival stories often sound inspiring from a distance. A young man survives a gunshot wound to the head.
He fights through rehabilitation. He learns to walk, talk, and function again. On paper, it sounds like a miracle. But surviving violence does not necessarily mean escaping it. Many survivors spend years dealing with physical limitations, trauma, anxiety, and the constant fear that another attack could happen at any moment. Recovery is not a straight line. It is a daily process. In neighborhoods shaped by retaliation, surviving can sometimes place a target on a person's back all over again. The conflict that nearly killed them often remains unresolved. That is what makes these stories so complicated. Survival is a victory, but it is not always freedom. But here's the part that should sit heavy on your chest. Nobody was ever arrested. Not for Dusky, not for the 6 shot at the funeral, not for the 5 shot 2 days after that. All of it still open and still unsolved to this very day. The people who turned a young man's funeral into a shooting gallery walked away from those church steps, and as far as the public record shows, they are still walking around free right now. Hold on to that feeling, that mix of anger and helplessness, because you're going to feel it again before this is over. Because a few years later, and a few states away, another young man's funeral would collapse into the same nightmare. Unfortunately, Chicago was not unique. If you study funeral shootings across America, you start noticing the same ingredients appearing over and over again. Young victims, ongoing disputes, social media threats, public gatherings where emotions are already running high. Different cities, different names, different streets, but the same pattern. That is what brings us to Pittsburgh. Now, let me carry you to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and introduce you to a young man named John James Hornezes, Jr. John wasn't a famous rapper. He was a 20-year-old kid from the north side of Pittsburgh, born on January 7, 2002. The pictures his people shared of him show a young man in a basketball jersey with the number 12. His mother is named Tamika Hornezes, and later, standing in a courtroom, she would call losing her son the most traumatizing experience of her life. Her godmother, Paige Davis, would stand up in the middle of all this pain and beg her own community for peace. The people who loved John have spent a long time trying to set the record straight about him, and you can understand why. Once a young black man dies in a shooting, the world has a habit of flattening him down into a headline and moving right along. But John was a whole person. He had a family who adored him, a mother whose grief had never once lifted, and a godmother who stood up in front of cameras during the worst moment of her life and asked people to choose peace instead of revenge. But John was living in a city that was bleeding. Pittsburgh in 2022 hit a homicide count it hadn't seen in years, with more than 70 people killed across the city, a lot of them young and tied to the same kind of neighborhood disputes that swallow up kids before they ever get a real chance. John was caught up in one of those disputes, and the day it caught up with him was October 15, 2022. That afternoon, John and a couple of associates were outside a Sunoco gas station on Cedar Avenue, over in the East Allegheny part of the North Side. Police say what began as some kind of dispute turned into gunfire, and here's where the tragedy multiplies, because John and his group opened fire on a passing SUV. Inside that SUV were rivals, and those rivals fired right back. And in the middle of all that lead flying back and forth across a busy street, 2 women who had nothing to do with any of it were standing at a nearby bus stop, just waiting on a ride. Their names were Betty Jean Averett, 59 years old, and Jacqueline Mahalik, 33, a young woman with her whole life still stretched out in front of her. When violence like this goes off in a public place, it doesn't politely stay between the people who started it. It fans out and takes whoever is close: a woman waiting on a bus, a child in a daycare, a mourner on a church step.
The killing sent a shock through the whole city. Anti-violence workers and community leaders in Pittsburgh spoke out, pointing at the same root causes they had been naming for years: the easy access to guns, the beefs that never get resolved, the trauma that gets handed down from one generation to the next and never gets treated, the way one shooting almost always plants the seed for the next one. The city was already on pace for one of its deadliest years in a long time, and here was another painful example of exactly how it happens. And the terrible part is John's family sensed it coming. That's the detail that's going to hurt you in a minute. By the time they started planning his funeral, they weren't just grieving, they were watching their backs. Word was moving through the neighborhood that the other side might not be finished, that a gathering as public and as predictable as a funeral could be seen by the wrong people not as a place of mourning, but as a target, with everybody lined up in one spot. It's a horrible thing to have to turn over in your mind while you're picking out a casket for your child. But this family turned it over, and then they did the one thing that should have kept everyone safe. They asked for help. They were afraid and had every reason in the world to be. 13 days after John died in that crossfire, his loved ones gathered at Destiny of Faith Church to lay him to rest, holding on to a simple, desperate hope that the violence would have the decency to stop at the door. It did not. The funeral for John Hornezes Jr. was held on October 28, 2022, at Destiny of Faith Church in the Brighton Heights neighborhood of Pittsburgh. The service was being live-streamed so that family who couldn't be there in person could still say goodbye. The pews were filled with mourners, young children and older folks among them, everybody there to grieve a 20-year-old. And then, right around noon, as people gathered near the church, the gunfire opened up from the outside.
In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, authorities say that two gunmen opened fire at this event from the outside of the Destiny of Faith Church, which is on Pittsburgh's north side.
The city's gunshot detection system picked it up in 2 separate waves, which tells you how much lead was in the air.
Police say that two gunmen, they believe, opened fire and that a shot spotter system, which is an audio system used by police to track gunshots, initially reported 5 shots fired in the block of this church and then another 15 shots.
All told, right around 20 rounds were fired at people standing outside a funeral. Inside the church, the live stream captured the raw panic, mourners throwing themselves under the pews, the entire service dissolving into screaming and scrambling. When it was over, 6 people were hurt, 5 of them struck by gunfire, and 1 more injured just trying to run for their life.
Court documents later spelled out exactly what the cameras captured, and what is chilling about it is how calm and deliberate the shooters were. 2 males holding weapons with extended magazines were seen on surveillance footage approaching the church on Benton Avenue. These were men who came with extended magazines, walked up on a house of worship in broad daylight, and started hunting human beings. The other males started firing at a man standing on the sidewalk in front of the church. The man collapsed near a horse and carriage, and the assailant began chasing him while firing. One of the shooters ran a man down while he was still squeezing the trigger. That is the level of coldness we are dealing with. And this is the gut punch you have been waiting for, because John's family saw it coming and tried to stop it. They had asked the police for protection at the funeral because they were hearing rumblings that somebody might try exactly this kind of attack. But when the day arrived, the officers who were supposed to be on that detail were nowhere on the scene. When the family later pressed for answers about why, it came out that those officers had reportedly been sent to the wrong location entirely, and the city's police oversight board opened an inquiry into the whole breakdown. Think about the position John's family was placed in. They were not surprised that violence might happen. In fact, they were worried enough to ask for protection beforehand. Imagine what that says about the environment they were living in. Imagine planning a funeral and having to spend part of that process wondering whether someone might attack the service. Most families worry about flowers, transportation, and who will speak at the memorial. This family was worrying about gunmen. That reality alone tells you how deeply violence had embedded itself into everyday life.
But now here is where this case splits off from the others, and I need you to notice the difference because it matters. Unlike Chicago, the Pittsburgh case actually got solved fast. The very next day, police arrested two young men, a 19-year-old named Sean Davis and a 16-year-old named Hezekiah Nixon. Surveillance video from nearby businesses tracked a dark Hyundai Elantra leaving the scene, and detectives traced the license plate. Footage from the McKees Rocks Bridge taken before the shooting showed that same car with two masked people sitting inside, crossing over toward the church. And after the shooting, it ran right back the same way. So when officers moved in near the suspect's home late that afternoon and watched the two young men climb into that Elantra, they followed and tried to stop them on that same bridge. That is the moment one of them bolted on foot and hurled a gun over the side into the river below, while the other one dropped his weapon on the road. Back at headquarters, the clothing on one of them matched the outfit worn by the shooter in the surveillance footage almost exactly, right down to the small details. And search warrants turned up even more clothing, marijuana, and weapon magazines. Piece by piece, everything gave them up. The charges stacked up high: attempted homicide, criminal conspiracy, aggravated assault, a long list of firearms counts, and even a cruelty to animals charge for that wounded horse. And in the end, something the other families in this story never got actually happened here. Justice landed. At a preliminary hearing in early 2023, prosecutors laid the surveillance out for the court in split screen, and the charges were held for trial. Then, in September of 2025, Hezekiah Nixon pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 11 to 22 years in prison. Sean Davis is still awaiting his trial as of the latest word. The city's mayor publicly praised the police for how fast they moved to make the arrests, and compared to the other stories in this video, that speed was rare enough to be worth noting. Cases like this also highlight the enormous role technology now plays in criminal investigations. Surveillance cameras, license plate readers, cell phone records, social media posts, and digital evidence have changed the way detectives solve crimes. 20 years ago, many cases depended almost entirely on eyewitness testimony. Today, investigators can often rebuild entire timelines using digital evidence. In Pittsburgh, those tools helped investigators move quickly. But technology is only useful when the evidence exists. In many unsolved cases, cameras are missing, footage is unclear, witnesses stay silent, or crucial information never reaches investigators. That difference can determine whether a family gets answers or spends years waiting for them. And separately, another teenager tied to that original gas station shootout that took John's life was sentenced to 8 to 12 years behind bars, some of it running alongside time for yet another shooting he was involved in. And do not skip past how young the two shooters were, because it matters. One of them was 19 and the other was only 16 years old, a child by any measure, already accused of helping shoot up a church full of mourners in the middle of the day. That is how deep this sickness runs in these neighborhoods, where a boy barely old enough to drive can look out on a funeral and see nothing but targets. So when the day of sentencing finally came, John's mother had to sit in that courtroom and live the whole thing all over again, the loss of her son stacked right on top of the terror of that funeral, one heartbreak piled onto another. It did not bring John back to her, and it did not unhurt a single one of the people who got shot, but at least this one time somebody was actually made to answer for what happened on those church steps. So sit with that for a second. 6 people were shot at a funeral, and the men who did it got caught, got charged, and got sent to prison. That's what accountability actually looks like when a system works. Now hold that thought close, because the very last family in this story never got any of it. Not one arrest and not one answer. And their loss might just be the heaviest of them all, because it wasn't one son they lost. It was 3. Now we travel to New Orleans, to a family named Veal, and to a kind of pain that is almost too big to hold. Because this is not the story of one young man taken. This is the story of 3 brothers and how one family lost every single one of their sons within the span of a single week. Let me introduce them to you the way their own people did, because their family fought hard to make sure the world saw them as more than a statistic. There was Brandon Jurell Veal, the oldest at 30, the one his family called the commander, the leader his little brothers looked up to and adored. There was Brian Jamal Veal, the middle brother, at 26, remembered as a free-spirited, fun-loving guy. And there was Bradley Justin Veal, the baby of the family, at 21, the mama's boy who watched over the family bond and his mother's heart like it was a sacred duty. Their aunt, who became one of the loudest voices fighting for them, summed the 3 of them in a way that just sticks to your ribs. She said they were 3 peas in a pod.
3 brothers murdered within 7 days of each other.
These were the sons of Byron Jerome Veal, a respected master plasterer in New Orleans, a genuine craftsman who spent his life restoring the plaster and stucco inside the historic mansions of that city. It was the kind of work that even earned him recognition as a design master in the local preservation world. He came up rough himself and turned his whole life around through that trade, which is exactly the kind of father these boys had. And Byron did not come up on an easy road. By his own telling, he was once a troubled kid running with the wrong crowd, and credits the plastering trade, learned over years of training under older master craftsmen, with pulling his life onto a straighter path. He built a real business out of it, worked on the mansions and historic homes of New Orleans, took on clients whose names people would recognize, and raised his sons inside that world of hard work, music, and culture. And the one thing this family wants the world to know above everything else is that these were not street kids out living that life, but hard-working, family-loving young men who cracked jokes with each other and rarely spent a single day apart. Gentle giants, as one relative described them, or big teddy bears who just so happened to be each other's best friends. That truth matters because it makes what happened to them so much harder to explain and so much harder to accept. The nightmare began on February 13th, 2021. Around 8 minutes past 5 in the evening, the 3 brothers were walking together near the corner of Washington and Loyola Avenues in Central City, close to home. And according to what the brothers themselves later told their father, this was not some random thing. A car had been following them. That car pulled up beside them and opened fire from inside the vehicle. Brian, the middle brother, was struck multiple times and died right there at the scene. Bradley, the youngest brother, was shot twice, but somehow he survived that first attack. Brandon, the oldest, was not hit at all. In just a few seconds, the commander watched one brother die on the pavement and another bleed beside him. And then something happened that this family has never been able to make peace with. Instead of comfort, instead of help, the 2 surviving brothers, one of them shot twice and bleeding out in the street, were detained by the police and booked for battery on an officer. The family says the only reason was to get control of a chaotic scene because the brothers were understandably out of their minds after watching Brian get murdered right in front of them. Their parents were not even in the city when it happened. They were away in Baton Rouge, sitting down to dinner with no idea their whole world had just been split in half. And that is how the father found out, through a phone call from his oldest son, Brandon, calling not from the scene, not from a hospital, but from a jail cell, trying to explain through the shock that his brother was dead and that he and his wounded baby brother had been locked up instead of being helped. A crime camera near the corner did capture the car pulling up and firing, but the footage was not clear enough to identify anyone, and the family says they were never even shown it. When reporters later requested the incident report, there was reportedly no mention in it of why the brothers were held in the first place. So on top of losing Brian, this family carries the memory of how the survivors were treated in that first raw hour. Cuffed and booked instead of held and comforted, one of them bleeding the whole time. That is its own kind of wound, the kind that never really closes. But they had no idea it was about to happen all over again. Exactly 1 week was all the time the Veal family got to catch their breath before the second blow came down on them. 7 days after Brian was gunned down in the street, while his funeral was still being planned, the two brothers who had survived that first attack were about to walk into the final moments of their own lives. It was February 20th, 2021. Earlier that day, the boys' father had sent them some money for food. His last words with them was simple and loving, the kind of ordinary goodbye you never think will be the last one. Brandon and Bradley went to the bank to pick up that money, then stopped at a McDonald's to grab some food, part of it meant for their grieving mother waiting back home. Let that settle for a second. The final errand of their lives was getting their mama something to eat while she mourned her middle son. And on the walk back home, in the 3100 block of Carondelet Street, the two of them were ambushed. This was not a quick drive-by like the first attack. 3 people came out from behind a row of trees and bushes at the corner and were carrying guns of 3 different calibers. The gunfire was so heavy that stray bullets tore into at least 4 nearby homes. A neighbor's security camera caught the sound of it, and it was not a handful of shots, but a full wave of gunfire. The people who live on that block have not been the same since that night, and neither has the neighborhood. Bradley, the baby of the family, the mama's boy who had already survived being shot twice just 1 week earlier, died right there at the scene. Brandon, the commander, the oldest, was rushed to the hospital where he too was pronounced dead. In the span of 7 days, all 3 Veal brothers were gone. A mother and father who had 3 living sons on one Saturday had 0 by the next. The family says the mother went through a mental health emergency under the crushing weight of it all, and honestly, who on this earth could blame her? She had gone from planning 1 funeral to planning 3, all while her surviving sons were being buried instead of being protected. They laid their boys to rest quietly out of pure fear, keeping the guest list small and even hiring outside security from another parish just to make sure nothing happened at the graves. That is the level of terror this family was living in, so frightened that they could not even grieve their sons out loud in the open the way any family deserves to. Think about what that funeral actually was. 1 week earlier, they had been planning a single service for Brian. Now they were burying all 3 of their sons at once, a mother and father standing in front of 3 of their own children in caskets, in a city where the killing had become so ordinary that nearly 300 more people would be murdered in just the time it took this family to go 1 single year without an answer. And here is the part that will stay with you long after this video ends. As of today, nobody has been arrested for any of it. Not for Brian, not for Brandon, not for Bradley. And it is not because there was nothing to work with. Police located the car used in the first shooting, and the killers had actually tried to burn it to destroy the evidence, but they failed, and the car was recovered and swabbed for DNA. And still, no match ever came back from the databases. On the second shooting, a nearby city crime camera didn't even capture the murders because of a timing problem with when it was recording, a failure the family simply cannot get past. For more than a year straight, this family emailed nearly every level of city government trying to get answers. They put the faces of their 3 sons up on billboards and bus stops, paid for in part by anonymous donors who were moved by the story. Crime Stoppers put up a reward of $10,000 for anybody with information, and when the family finally sat down to speak publicly about what happened, they had to do it in silhouette, faces hidden in shadow, voices shielded, because the people who murdered all 3 of their boys are still out there somewhere, still free.
Whoever the perpetrators are still walking around doing whatever, and we have no idea who they could be or who they are.
There's another reason this case continues to resonate with so many people. Most families affected by violence are forced to grieve one devastating loss at a time. The Veal family did not get that opportunity. Before they could even process Brian's death, they were confronted with another tragedy. Before they could begin healing, they were planning more funerals. Grief experts often describe mourning as a process that takes time. Time to understand what happened, time to adapt, time to rebuild. The Veal family never received that time.
Their losses arrived on top of each other like waves, each one crashing before the previous one had even settled.
We know nothing, and we just want answers. They deserve that.
Looking across all three stories, it becomes clear that funeral shootings are not really about funerals. The funeral is simply the stage where much older conflicts reappear. The violence usually begins weeks, months, or even years earlier. By the time bullets start flying at a church or cemetery, the underlying anger has already been growing for a long time. That is why these incidents are so difficult to prevent. Stopping a funeral shooting often requires stopping the chain of events that leads to it in the first place. Community leaders, pastors, violence interrupters, police officers, and family members have spent years searching for ways to break those cycles. Some succeed, many do not. But every one of them is fighting against the same reality. Retaliation has a way of creating new victims faster than communities can heal the old wounds. And that reality is visible in every story you've heard today. So look at everything we have laid out for you across these three cities. In Chicago, a rapper was killed, and then his funeral was turned into a massacre where 6 more people were shot, and to this day, nobody has paid for any of it. In Pittsburgh, a young man was killed in a crossfire, and then his funeral was shot up too, but at least there the shooters were caught and sent away to prison. And in New Orleans, 3 brothers, 3 peas in a pod, were wiped out inside of a single week, and their killers are still walking around free years later. 2 of these 3 cases are still wide open. That means the people who did these things could be scrolling past this video right now, could be riding past a billboard with their own victims' faces staring down at them, living their lives like nothing ever happened. If you know anything at all about the shootings in Chicago or about the murders of the Veal brothers in New Orleans, you could be the one tip that finally cracks it open. Because these families are still sitting in the dark, still waiting on a phone call that never comes. And after everything they have lost, they deserve an answer. Now, if you've never left a comment on any story I've shared on this channel, this is the one I'd love to hear your thoughts on. Your comment could help another mother, another family, or someone facing a similar situation.
I'm the wife, I'm prettier, and I just show him my boobs and I win the argument.
Come on, man, we got some of the toughest old folks in our family. They don't wear no damn sunscreen. What are you talking? Man, no way. No way. My granddaddy was working in the heat. My grandma working in the heat. They ain't had no sunscreen. They was working. They was getting it in. Like, go in the kitchen and get the
Me and my husband are the same color. Look at us. We the same color.
We sure is.
We the same.
On the morning of January 7, 2024, a teenager would dial 911. She had just walked into a heartbreaking scene. Her mother had been stabbed 17 times on her neck and chest. When the police arrived at the apartment on McKinney Drive in Westland, Michigan, what they found was gruesome. They found a 49-year-old devoted wife found covered in multiple stab wounds, lifeless and in a pool of her own blood. No one could have predicted what had happened until they discovered the shocking truth that would change everything. The very person responsible for killing her was the same person who had vowed to protect and care for her. But the most chilling detail of it was that he did it all these years after she told him her secret. This is the life and death of Kelly Mays.
My daughters have helped me heal because I look at them and I'm hopeful for a world without domestic violence. I know statistically that they are at risk, but I'm hopeful for them. I'm hopeful for me. I'm hopeful that these stories that I'm sharing will be a tool, a guide for them. And the most real I am with myself, and it's helped me go and reach into dark places that I wouldn't otherwise be able to talk about, experiences that I wouldn't be able to talk about, and to bring them out and share them with people. It's empowered me, it's empowered other survivors to share their experiences.
Kelly's story takes us to the quiet suburban city of Westland, Michigan, USA. Known for its welcoming neighborhoods, sprawling parks, and strong community ties, Westland often radiates a sense of calm and security, a place where tragedy seems out of reach. Yet even towns like Westland aren't immune to darkness. And it was within this very city that Kelly's life was horrifically cut short, right inside her own home. 49-year-old Kelly Ann Mays was born on November 21, 1974, to Ralph Mays and Janice Watkins Mays in Detroit, Michigan. She was the youngest of 3 children and held a special place in the family. Her sister Stacy lovingly nicknamed her Twin B, a reflection of their deep and inseparable bond. From an early age, Kelly's kindness, academic focus, and emotional strength were impossible to miss. She cared deeply, worked hard, and never gave up, traits that followed her throughout her life and education. Kelly graduated from Detroit Public Schools, where her drive and determination began to shine. She later attended Central Michigan University, earning a bachelor's degree in psychology. But her academic journey didn't stop there. She went on to earn a master's degree in counseling from the University of Phoenix. Still, Kelly wasn't done pushing herself. She returned to CMU to pursue a second master's degree. By 2021, she was just months away from achieving this new goal. But heartbreakingly, this milestone was one she would never get the chance to reach. As Kelly embarked on her professional journey, her innate compassion and evolving expertise laid the groundwork for her life's mission. She became the Community and Staff Training Program Manager at Hejira Health, Inc., where she also served as a mental health therapist. Working primarily with children and teens, Kelly brought a deeply personal touch to every session. She had a rare gift, being able to hold space for someone in their darkest hour and guide them gently toward healing. Her office was more than a clinical environment. It was a sanctuary for those seeking hope. Yet behind this professional success and community impact, Kelly faced a nightmare she knew all too well.
So God removed that person out of your life, and they moved on. And as a result, you no longer have a stomachache. They are someone else's stomachache. So consider yourself, well, lucky. They've moved on. They're someone else's stomachache. And God is taking care of you. So be blessed. You no longer have spoiled milk in your refrigerator.
In 2008, she entered a relationship with a man who would change the course of her life in a devastating way. Though his identity remains unclear, what is certain is that Kelly loved him fiercely and missed the warning signs that later revealed themselves in abusive behavior. What started as a loving relationship gradually became marked by control, manipulation, and emotional abuse. Then, in 2010, tragedy struck on their daughter's first birthday. An explosive argument escalated into a violent physical assault. Kelly was left gravely injured and was hospitalized. That moment left a permanent scar, but it did not define her. Instead, it ignited a new purpose. After the attack, she ended the marriage and turned her pain into purpose, becoming an outspoken advocate against domestic violence. Kelly made it her mission to ensure others would not suffer in silence, as she once did. Her work provided a lifeline for many, and her story became a beacon of resilience and hope. Driven by determination and passion, Kelly emerged as a compelling motivational speaker. She shared her journey on news channels, podcasts, and at events centered on domestic abuse awareness, mental health, and trauma recovery. Her lived experience gave her words authenticity. She didn't just talk about survival, she embodied it. Through her nonprofit, A Survivor's Story, Kelly created safe spaces for others to heal, transforming her pain into purpose and empowering those still finding their voice. But just when Kelly seemed to have reclaimed her footing, fate sent another unexpected twist. She met 31-year-old Jimmy Lee Brown, a man who seemed to represent love and stability at last. At first, everything appeared perfect. Jimmy seemed exactly the kind of person someone might build a life with. Charming, funny, someone who just clicked with Kelly. On top of that, he appeared to have a respectable background. He was known as a rapper featured in the movie 8 Mile alongside Eminem and performed under the stage name Supa MC.
Okay, we not getting nowhere. But you know, at the end of the day, what's going to happen is I'm going to say, I want you to wear sunscreen. He's going to say, I'm not going to wear sunscreen. I'm going to just cry and say, but I love you. Can you please wear sunscreen? Because I think it's really, really important. And he's going to wear sunscreen. There you go.
Come on, man. We got some of the toughest old folks in our family. They don't wear no damn sunscreen. What are you talking? Man, no way. No way. My granddaddy was working in the heat. My grandma working in the heat. They ain't had no sunscreen. They was working. They was getting it in. Like, go in the kitchen and get the
Me and my husband are the same color. Look at us. We the same color.
We sure is.
We the same color. I'm dark, just like my husband. I got the melanin.
You have a dark mind.
I hate you. He gonna still wear the sunscreen. I don't know what he's talking about. He mad. I always win the arguments because, you know, I'm the wife, I'm prettier, and I just show him my boobs and I win the argument.
But beneath this charismatic exterior lay a hidden past, one that should have triggered all of Kelly's instincts. In 1993, Jimmy was convicted of using a firearm during 2 separate crimes, an assault that could have caused grievous injury and an armed robbery. He served prison time for both before being released. These convictions weren't just remnants of a rough past. They were clear warnings that Jimmy was capable of serious violence. But despite those red flags, Kelly made the same mistake again. She chose to overlook them. Kelly convinced herself that love could overcome even the darkest history. In 2015, she married Jimmy, committing to what she hoped would be a lifelong partnership. At first, their relationship felt stable. Jimmy seemed affectionate, supportive, and even joined Kelly at advocacy events, proudly standing beside her as she spoke about survival and empowerment. From the outside, they were building a future grounded in mutual growth and healing. But not just that. Jimmy stepped into a fatherly role for Kelly's daughters, attending birthday parties, school events, and graduations. Kelly often shared joyful moments on social media, family outings, playful banter, and examples of the loving dynamic that Kelly's daughters came to appreciate in Jimmy.
See what I gotta do with and the cheese on.
For the better part of 13 years, their marriage appeared to embody the stable, happy life Kelly had always hoped for. Genuine moments of joy and togetherness filled their home. Yet behind those smiles, a disturbing reality would slowly reveal itself. Over the years together, Kelly and Jimmy's relationship was far from perfect. Behind closed doors, the tension had been steadily growing. What might have once been playful teasing between them slowly transformed into harsh arguments and cutting remarks. Her 2 young daughters witnessed it all, the shouting matches and the moments when tension filled the air like smoke. They watched their mother try to stay composed, trying to make a family work even as the foundation cracked beneath them. And as time passed, the arguments became more intense. At first, Kelly tried to shield her children from it all. But kids sense more than adults like to admit. They could see the sadness in her eyes. Eventually, her daughters, frightened, confused, and desperate for peace, begged her to end the relationship. But like many survivors of domestic abuse, Kelly stayed. She told herself she was staying for the children, for the vows she made, for the hope that things might change. She clung to the man Jimmy used to be, or the version of him she once loved. Still, a person can only carry so much before the weight becomes unbearable. Despite her efforts to keep the marriage together, she was running out of strength. And what neither she nor anyone around her could predict was just how fast everything would unravel.
I didn't have enough money to fill my car and my child's belly. Funny how life is. Keep writing, you will get to funny. Keep laughing. Laughter is the only thing that will make this poem funny. Like that time I wrote my first haiku along the wall of my college dorm. Funny, it was actually a suicide note. Funny, no one noticed.
By the start of 2024, something inside Kelly had shifted. After enduring years of emotional strain and turmoil, she finally found the strength to say the words that had lived silently in her mind for far too long. One evening, she looked Jimmy in the eyes, calm but resolute, and told him her secret. She was done. It wasn't just a spontaneous decision. It was the result of months, if not years, of internal battle, of trying to convince herself that things would get better. But now, she has reached her edge, and she said it plainly. she was leaving. Just as she had told other women in her advocacy work and community talks, she now had to take her own advice.
Get the process, get the courage to move forward. What's the first step?
The first step is deciding when you're ready to leave. You know, like survivors have to decide when they're ready to leave. You can't make someone leave. You can't encourage them to leave, but at that moment when they're ready to leave. The second thing is to get support. Haven is a great organization to find and to connect with supports, to also talk with survivors like me.
Her life, her safety, her future, her children, all of it depended on this choice. And at first, the man she was leaving didn't give her a reason to worry. Jimmy didn't argue at first. He seemed to take the news quietly, almost too quietly. They talked mostly about the details: who would take what, where the girls would stay, how they'd split responsibilities. There were no loud confrontations, no police calls, no visible signs of chaos. From the outside, everything appeared civil. But under the surface, something far more dangerous was brewing. After a few days, Jimmy began to unravel. He withdrew, grew angry, and became obsessively fixated on Kelly's decision. To him, her choice wasn't healthy or final, it was betrayal. While he claimed he understood, underneath it all, he hadn't accepted it. Kelly didn't realize just how close she was to danger, but his rage was building toward a devastating climax. And then things would take a horrifying turn of events. On the morning of January 7th, 2024, one of Kelly's daughters, Celeste, returned to their apartment on McKinney Drive in Westland, Michigan, and immediately sensed something was wrong. The silence hit her the moment she stepped inside. It was the kind of quiet that weighs heavy before the mind can process it. The lights were on, Kelly's belongings untouched, but there was no answer when Celeste called out. She moved through the living room, her unease mounting with each step. By the time she reached her mother's bedroom, she found herself face to face with a nightmare she never expected. Kelly lay collapsed on the floor, her body surrounded by a pool of blood. Multiple deep wounds marred her neck and chest. There were no signs of forced entry, no sign of a struggle outside that room, just the aftermath of brutal violence. It was a scene too traumatic for any daughter to witness. Driven by denial, Celeste reached out and touched Kelly's foot, hoping for a pulse, but all she felt was the cold hardness of death. It was then she knew her mother was gone. Shaking uncontrollably, Celeste dialed 911. Moments later, Westland police arrived and confirmed Celeste's worst fear. Kelly Mays was dead. She had been stabbed 17 times, with the majority of wounds inflicted to the neck and chest. The violence of the attack stunned the officers. Who could commit such a savage act? As the investigation began, detectives focused on those closest to Kelly. In Celeste's mind, only one person matched the profile, a man with the motive, the history, and the capacity for such brutality, Jimmy Lee Brown. Before detectives could issue an arrest warrant or start searching for him, something unexpected happened. Just hours later, Jimmy walked into the Westland Police Department and surrendered. There was no pursuit, no refusal, no attempt to evade responsibility. The man who took Kelly's life simply walked in without a word. To investigators, his surrender was a breakthrough and chilling confirmation of their darkest suspicions. But it marked only the beginning of a long and painful fight for justice. On January 8, 2024, the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office filed a first-degree murder charge against Jimmy Lee Brown in connection with Kelly's death. News of his surrender spread rapidly. Within hours, the story was headline news across Detroit outlets and social media, fueled by the shock surrounding Kelly, a prominent advocate for domestic abuse survivors. As investigators built their case and the community mourned, the legal process moved forward under intense scrutiny. Weeks turned into months, and the weight of evidence and the grief of Kelly's loved ones weighed heavily on the courtroom.
We're learning more tonight about an important voice for domestic violence victims that has been silenced.
Yeah, Kelly Mays was a well-known survivor of domestic violence who found her voice helping others suffering through abusive relationships at home. The man accused of killing her is Jimmy Lee Brown. Now, he's a rap artist known as Super MC.
Then Jimmy Wood stunned many. Jimmy didn't put up a courtroom fight, he just pledged guilty.
To avoid a long trial, he admitted to second-degree murder and formally expressed remorse for the killing of 40-year-old Kelly Ann Mays. Yet his apology fell flat, as it failed to erase the horror of her murder or bring solace to those she left behind.
What argument or disagreement occurred that day? There's no argument or disagreement you should state that justified these acts.
Finally, on March 10, 2025, more than a year after Kelly's tragic death, the court handed down its sentence. Jimmy was given 18 to 40 years in prison, requiring at least 18 years before becoming eligible for parole. His punishment was far from sufficient to heal the wounds of her loss, but at least he would pay a steep legal price.
I always received an ecstatic happy birthday twin A from her, and I would reply, happy birthday twin B.
Meanwhile, Kelly's family remained in mourning. In the aftermath of her death, vigils were held to honor her legacy. Friends, coworkers, and survivors she mentored gathered to light candles, share photos, and speak not only of her death, but of the impact she had in life.
She was a loving person that cared about everybody. I mean, you know, Kelly, if she didn't even have to know you to come up to you and talk to you, she was a very open and honest person.
Mother figure, you know, anytime you did something, it was like, you can't do that, you know, it was like, do better, you know, she was always that motivator.
We want to promise, you know, to Kelly's memory is to continue the mission and continue to help awareness for domestic violence and knowing and people to continue to know that there's help.
Her daughters were hit hardest. Emily, the eldest, found herself thrust into a caretaker role for her younger sister. Celeste faced the loss of her mother while bracing herself to protect her sibling from the fallout of their new reality. On January 20, 2024, Kelly Ann Mays was laid to rest in Detroit, the city of her birth. As loved ones covered her grave with dirt, they whispered words of love and remembrance, determined that her spirit and her mission would continue to guide them. Kelly's tragic passing left a profound void in her family and reinforced the silent devastation of domestic violence. She was known for her courage, her advocacy, and her strength. But her death was a painful reminder that even the strongest can be hidden victims, fighting unseen battles. What do you think about it? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you found this story intriguing, please like, share, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.